are our greatest presidents? What lessons can the modern-day business leader learn from our 46 chiefs of state? Find out in this podcast series with Tom Fox and Richard Lummis to delve into the great and not-so-great presidents to mine their successes and failures for today's business executive.
Today we're going to continue our series on the leadership qualities of some of the early presidents of the United States. Today's topic is John Adams, our second president. For those interested, the standard biography is probably the one by David McCullough, cleverly titled John Adams, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Adams the Elder had a very lengthy and eventful public career beginning in the late 1760s. He first came to national prominence as the legal counsel who defended the British officer and soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre, 1770. His presidency also and his leadership during the Revolution are also going to be topics we'll touch on during this podcast. Tom, what lessons do you think we can learn from John Adams that are applicable to leadership today?
So I do have to start off by talking about McCullough's biography, because if you haven't read it, it's a fabulous book. It's a fabulous read. It opened up a world to me that I had not focused on, which was New England in the pre-revolution and not simply Boston. And also I just have to mention the love affair that came across between Adams and his wife. I was not really aware that the love affair between she and her husband throughout, and she was his number one confidant. So if you have a chance to read the McCullough cleverly titled work, John Adams, I would encourage you to do so. Lots to really talk about. Some of the things that leadership skills that I observed in my research for this podcast, Richard, was that Adams did not operate in a bubble, and he sought counsel from others. And we saw this, I thought, most particularly in his leadership in the revolutionary, I can't remember the title, it wasn't Revolutionary Council, but he was a part of the group that led the Revolutionary Congress after 1775 and forward, and led the war effort. And that included obviously the appointment of Washington, but also financial health of the colonies, the logistical support for the war, writing of laws for the state of Massachusetts. He was governor of the state of Massachusetts. Just a wide variety of work in the revolutionary government part. He was not a soldier. I would not have said he was a statesman. He was something else. But the leadership skills that he brought to bear, where he always utilized others, always sought counsel from others. He's famous for saying facts are a stubborn thing, and particularly around the Boston Massacre. As a legal, with my legal training, he was one of the true heroes of the legal profession for defending the officer who's alleged to have given the order to fire that led to the Boston Massacre. And he successfully defended that officer from a charge brought by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts at the time. And so it taught us as lawyers that just because the greater populace may want someone hung, literally, doesn't mean a lawyer can't and shouldn't do their job and can do so successfully. And that if you put 12 people in the box, i.e. the jury, that they will, if presented with facts, come around to the right answer. So that was really kind of an early leadership lesson. I know you had a really interesting alternative view of that you had taken in or determined in some research. So I might let you share with that, because I hadn't heard it, and frankly, I think it's a fascinating story on at least that part of his career as counsel for the British officer who was led the British troops in the Boston Massacre.
He also represented the individual soldiers. There were 8 soldiers, as I recall, and he got 6 of them acquitted, and the other 2 were only found guilty of manslaughter and were branded on their thumbs. And so Adams was absolutely vilified for taking the case in the first place. He feared for his safety. He feared for his wife's safety, not unreasonably given the climate in Boston at the time. numerous royal officials had had to flee for their lives and had their houses burned and so forth. So personal safety was a real concern, and yet he still took it. And the classic view, which is that of McCulloch, is that he did it out of purely disinterested motives and respect for the majesty of the law. The alternative view is that he took it as an attempt to basically cover up the role of the Sons of Liberty in Boston in fomenting the attack of the mob on the soldiers that resulted in the soldiers shooting back. And I think it's more a devil's advocate argument than it is the truth. I think we frequently forget how consumed people at this time were with the concept of personal honor and integrity. And they didn't always live up to it in person, but certainly they held it up as an ideal far more than most of our politicians do today. But he, when describing the mob, he described them as a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues and outlandish jacktars, and fails to mention that such mobs were frequently organized by the Sons of Liberty specifically for the purpose of provoking the British. And he manages to present this as an inevitable occurrence of the British being there in the first place. But he definitely overlooks or downplays the conspiracy to provoke the British in his defense of the soldiers.
I misnamed his wife. It was Abigail Adams, not Dolly Adams. So I apologize for that. But one of the interesting quotes from Adams himself was that really it showed the strength of his leadership, reflected the strength of his marriage. And he said it was the paradox, or McCulloch said rather, it was a paradox of their lives. As much as the public role kept them apart, Adams always needed to be with Abigail and she with him. They would never become accustomed to being separated. So as a happily married man, I'm certainly pleased to read that. Another leadership lesson is the ability to see or the ability to see in others abilities, recognizing talent. Washington, it was Adams who was the first to submit Washington's name for the General of the Continental Army. It was actually Adams who recruited Thomas Jefferson to draft the Declaration of Independence, and he asked Benjamin Franklin to help edit that document. So I realize that when you have that kind of team together or that kind of talent, it may be obvious. Nevertheless, putting the right people in the right place, particularly around the writing of the Declaration of Independence, was a key component of what Adams brought to the leadership of the Continental Congress. We talked about perseverance, and he was a farmer. He was a farmer in New England. I can't imagine a more difficult task, frankly, than being a farmer in New England, both from the soil and the climate as well. Nevertheless, he learned perseverance. He was not a particularly good speaker when he began his public career, but he worked, he read books, he read essays, he studied the classics, he studied Cicero, he studied the speeches of Demosthenes, and he practiced those speeches. Now, that was done quite often in that time frame because they were great speeches and they were recorded. Nevertheless, he also showed, as we talked about in a little bit earlier podcast on Andrew Jackson, that you can be a self-made man, and that self-matedness, if I can make up that word, can take you to greatness. One of the things that I recall most vividly from the from the Adams presidency was the Xyz Affair. And that was an affair took the United States and France to the brink of war. And it was an affair where certain American sailors were captured, and that Adams had to walk a very fine line between the Federalists who were clamoring for war, the Democratic Republicans led by Jefferson who wanted to have more friendly relations with the French, really to counteract the British. And the lesson I drew from that was not only could Adams navigate a particularly treacherous or multifaceted crisis, but he could see the big picture. And I think he could see that really America's future lay with a closer relationship with Britain, even though he had been condemned by the British to be hanged if they had won the war. And certainly we had another war upcoming with the British just a few years after his presidency ended. Nevertheless, he was able to see the larger picture and kept the United States out of war. So anything that you saw in either of those two events that you thought granted or looked to leadership lessons, Richard?
Yeah, I think that I think you're right about the relationship with France. The French were impressing American sailors, so were the British. But he recognized correctly that the young republic was in no shape to fight a war with either. And I think one of the things that he was doing here was drawing on the well of respect that he had built up during that period in his service for the Revolutionary Congress, that people did respect his judgment based on his past performance. And going back to your point about his recognizing talent, a couple of things. One was his appointment, or his pushing for the appointment of George Washington. A lot of people were angling and pushing very hard to become head of the Continental Army. Washington was not. He was always very diffident about it. So in a way, for Adams to get him appointed was even more remarkable than it might appear at first glance, because he was pushing back against some very accomplished political actors who wanted the job for themselves. And in his appointment of Jefferson to write the Declaration, I think Adams was a very good communicator. He certainly no slouch as a writer. So I think one thing it shows here is his, I guess, innate modesty, his recognition that someone else was actually better for a job that he could perform quite competently himself.
You know, that's a great point because one of the things that we have talked about, I think, consistently as a leader, you need to recognize the talent in others. But if you are a very talented individual, you may, want to do it yourself simply because you can do it more quickly and efficiently. But number two, because of your talent level, you may not find that others really are up to your talent level. And you may, your point, though, I think, was that he recognized Jefferson had the greater talent. And that's an equally important skill to have in having the leadership. In a blog post by Tony Morgan, he had some leadership lessons he learned from John Adams, largely from reading the McCullough biography. And there's a couple that we really haven't highlighted too much, and some that we have. But one I thought was very interesting from the era, which was pay attention to physical health. And that's not something that we have talked about really at all, certainly your own personal health, but the health of a CEO, I think, can really impact a corporation. And without wishing to put the double hex on anyone, but the president of CEO, rather, of United Airlines, Oscar Munoz, he had a heart attack and had to have a heart transplant 1 month after he took over as CEO. And I've wondered what that effect, I've only had one catastrophic injury in my life, and it was simply a few broken bones. I didn't have my chest cracked for a new heart. And the recovery period is quite intensive, and the physical skills that you may have had before that event are going to be very different after the event. So paying attention to physical health and the physical health of a CEO may be an area that boards or CEOs or other leaders need to consider. Adams also was a lifetime learner, and I think you and I probably would accept that title as well. And I'm quite proud of it. On the other hand, it's not something I've striven to do, but it's just something that I do, and I do it because I love doing it. And Adams, I think, showed that if we could point to his correspondence with Jefferson, in the last 15 years of his life, it's now become well known that they corresponded, even though they were bitter political rivals. Part of that was a respect they had for each other as founding fathers, but also, I think it was certainly with Adams, was an attempt to learn and continue learning, and frankly, learning up to the day he died. So always or never stop learning is another very important lesson for leadership. And then finally, when there's a new vision, there'll always be grumbling. And if that's not a truism for leader, I think there are no truisms. So there are going to be people who grumble about change. And if you have learned and if you have synthesized the information and the facts and you need to make a change because you have a new vision, persevere with that vision.
Well, I think that's a great point. And I think part of the lifetime learning thing takes us back to his character as a self-made man. And he not only had an eye for talented people, but he had an eye for things that he thought he should know, and he had a real diligence about learning them. I think you pointed out his constant striving to improve his speaking skills.
So I'd really like to end with a quote from an article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review called Timeless Leadership by Brown and Fryer, where David McCullough, the author we've been talking about, was interviewed. And although this quote was not about Adams, I found it so powerful and ties into so many things that we have discussed in this podcast series. I really wanted to read it. And once again, it's David McCullough, the author of John Adams. So the question was how to become a certain type of presidential leader. And this was the response: start by listening. And this is the next part that I just fell in love with. If I were teaching a course at the Harvard Business School, I put a lot of emphasis on listening. Listening means asking good questions and taking in what people have to say. Listening also means hearing what people are saying, what's bugging them. And that is really one of the skills we have consistently talked about is good listening. But here McCullough details more than just sitting passively listening. You have to actively listen. You need to ask good questions. You need to hear what people are saying, and more importantly, what they are not saying and what's bugging them. And I recognize this was not about Adams, but I still think it was a great quote, and I just am so pleased that David McCullough talked about listening as a leadership lesson.
Yeah. That was an interesting interview. I think that was in Forbes, Harvard Business Review.
Yeah, HBR.
So, yeah, you might want to look it up if you have a chance.
We'll link to it in the show notes.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. It's informative as always.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this 4-part podcast series on leadership lessons from George Washington. If you have not done so and you've enjoyed this podcast, I would greatly appreciate if you would leave us a review on iTunes. It would help in our ratings and help get the word out about this most unusual podcast, which pairs historical figures in the forms of U.S. presidents and leadership lessons for today's business executives. This podcast series is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.